Before the man came the trauma. Julius Caesar was born into a dying republic in a crumbling patrician name. Its streets whispered with conspiracies, its marble pillars stained with blood. When Julius was still a child, the world he knew began to collapse. His uncle, Gaius Marius, the great general, was branded an enemy of the state. His allies hunted, his statues torn down, his aunt, married to Marius, disgraced, his father, a political ghost. Power was priceless. And then came Sulla, the man who redefined what Roman politics meant. He didn't win elections, he won sieges. Sulla marched on his own city, and once Rome's gates fell, he wrote his enemies' names on public lists called prescriptions, the polite Roman word for death warrants. Men Caesar knew, friends, teachers, distant cousins, were suddenly enemies of the state. Some vanished overnight, others didn't vanish fast enough. Their heads were nailed to the rostra, their estates auctioned off to loyalists. For young Julius, every walk through the city was a reminder that survival depended not on justice, but on choosing the right side. In that chaos, Caesar's father died suddenly. No protection, no shield from the storm. Now, barely a teenager, he stood as head of his family, a patrician name with no fortune, and the wrong political allies. Cornelia, Julius's wife, sits beside him at a small wooden table. He was still a teenager back then. The silence between them feels heavier than the air. Then, a knock. Not the knock of a neighbor, but the dull, deliberate pound of iron on wood. The door opens. 3 men in red-trimmed tunics enter, their bronze helmets catching the lamplight. They do not greet him. They do not sit. One unrolls a scroll. The order was simple. From Sulla himself, Julius Caesar was to divorce Cornelia or lose everything. For most men, this was no choice at all. Sulla was dictator. His will was law. Refuse him, and you would join the lists of the dead. But for Caesar, this wasn't about marriage. It wasn't even about love. It was about something far colder, a test. If he bent now, he would spend his life on his knees. He refused, not with shouting, not with pleas, just a flat, unwavering no. This was a direct challenge to Sulla's authority. But then, for some reason, no one understood but him. Sulla did not persecute Julius. Instead, he let him live. Maybe it was amusement, maybe curiosity, or maybe Sulla saw the truth. His words,
"In this boy, I see many Mariuses."
It was not a compliment. It was a prophecy. He vanished into the countryside, living like a fugitive, constantly on the move, hiding in strangers' barns, sleeping under the stars. But even in exile, Caesar was thinking ahead. He began cultivating allies quietly, storing up debts of loyalty that he would one day cash in. When Sulla died, he returned to Rome, but not into the heart of politics. Not yet. He understood Rome was still dangerous for a man with his name and connections to Marius. Caesar began his career in law, prosecuting corrupt governors. His speaking style was sharp and theatrical, designed not just to win cases, but to draw crowds. These trials were as much performance as justice. Caesar was making himself a public name without taking political office. In 80 BC, he fought in the siege of Mytilene and was awarded the Corona Civica, the civic crown, Rome's second highest military honor, given for saving the life of a fellow citizen in battle. This award gave him prestige, but more importantly, it gave him proof he could risk his life and win. While serving in Bithynia, Caesar was sent to the court of King Nicomedes IV to secure a fleet for Rome. He stayed longer than expected, long enough to spark rumors that his relationship with Nicomedes was unusually close. The whispers followed him for the rest of his life. His enemies would weaponize it in speeches, but Caesar never denied or confirmed it. In a way, he turned even scandal into a kind of untouchable mystery. With law, war, and diplomacy under his belt, Caesar decided to perfect his oratory in Rhodes under the famous teacher Apollonius Molon. That journey to Rhodes, meant to be the final sharpening of his most dangerous weapon, is when the pirates struck. In 75 BC, en route to study in Rhodes, Caesar's life took an unexpected turn. The Aegean Sea was thick with Cilician pirates. To most men, they were the stuff of nightmares. To Caesar, they were an inconvenience. When they kidnapped Caesar, they demanded 20 talents of silver for his ransom. Caesar laughed in their faces. He told them to ask for 50. It was not bravado for bravado's sake. It was psychological warfare. By inflating his own ransom, Caesar reframed himself, not as prey, but as someone worth more, someone important. For 38 days, he lived among them. He did not cower. He gave orders, joined in their games, even joked that once freed, he would return to crucify them all. They laughed. They thought it was part of the act. It wasn't. In truth, Caesar was watching, learning their routines, their guard shifts, their escape routes. He wasn't their prisoner. He was their student. When the ransom was paid and he was set free, Caesar didn't disappear into gratitude. He raised a small naval force, hunted them down, and kept his promise. Every last one of them was captured and crucified. But in a gesture that was pure Caesar, he ordered their throats cut before the nails went in. A final act of mercy. Not for their sake, but for his own image. It was a lesson for anyone who crossed him in the years to come. You could laugh with Caesar, but you would never laugh at him. The pirate crucifixions made him visible, not yet powerful, but noticed. Rome had no shortage of ambitious men, but most of them smiled only when the Senate was watching. Caesar, he smiled in the dark. He took small commands, mediocre assignments, but every battle, every skirmish, he turned into theater. And when the fighting ended, he didn't just bring back victory. He brought back loyalty. Men fought harder for him, not because they feared him, but because they believed he represents them. In a republic ruled by the rich, Caesar began building an army of the poor. Caesar returned to Rome at 30, not a hero, not even a soldier with glory to sell. He was a man in debt, with a famous name and dangerous ambitions. He began to climb through charm, the kind that makes allies feel special and enemies feel seen. Through debt, money borrowed from anyone foolish enough to believe he'd pay it back. Through bribes, little gifts, little favors, quietly traded in back rooms. Through words, razor-sharp speeches that made the people cheer and the Senate shift in their seats. And yet, behind his smile, there was a question.
What do I owe this broken republic, except its destruction?
He became a pontifex, a priest of Rome, a man of the gods. But under the robes, he was still a man of ambition. He watched Pompey, the greatest general alive, parade his victories before the Senate. He watched Cicero, the voice of the Republic, hold the city together with words. And he waited, not for them to fall, but for Rome itself to rot. Just enough. Only then could he carve it open. By day, he was the charming nobleman, the poet, the priest. By night, he was the debt-ridden schemer, gambling with borrowed gold. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, became his lifeline. Gold for campaigns, gold for bribes. In return, Crassus had a weapon no other senator possessed, a man who could walk into any room and already know who would betray him. Rome didn't yet fear Caesar, but they should have, because the blade he carried wasn't made of steel. It was patience. By 61 BC, Caesar's debts had become a joke in Rome. Senators whispered that if you shook him, denarii would fall out of his toga. So they sent him away, governor of further Spain. A post so distant, it felt like exile, a consolation prize for a man they thought was already finished. But exile can be a gift. In Spain, there were no political rivals to undercut him, only enemies to conquer, gold to seize, glory to claim. And Caesar learned something dangerous. War was not just survival, it was profit. Caesar's legions stormed tribal strongholds. They took towns, broke resistance, and filled his war chest with enough silver to make every debt vanish. But money was only the beginning. Standing before the statue of Alexander the Great in Cadiz, Caesar felt the weight of his own life. Alexander had conquered half the known world by the age of 32. Caesar was 39. And what had he done? Charmed senators, killed pirates. That day, he swore an oath he would not die until his name was known across every corner of the earth. Spain had given him more than wealth. It had given him vision, and Rome would not be ready for the man who was coming home. When Caesar returned from Spain in 60 BC, he was not the same man who had left. He came back rich, battle-hardened, and more ambitious than ever. But ambition is dangerous in Rome, especially when the Senate thinks it can still control you. They expected him to take the safe path, run for consul, retire with honor. Instead, Caesar wanted reforms that would upend the way power worked, and he knew he couldn't do it alone. So he made a deal with Pompey Magnus, Rome's most celebrated general, and Marcus Crassus, the richest man in the Republic. It was an alliance born of mutual need. Pompey wanted land for his veterans, Crassus wanted policies to protect his investments, and Caesar wanted everything. They called it the First Triumvirate. But to Rome, it was something far more dangerous. 3 men holding the Republic hostage. The deal worked. Caesar won the consulship, and the streets of Rome were his stage. But alliances in Rome are like shadows at sunset. They stretch long before they disappear. In 58 BC, Caesar left Rome for the governorship of Gaul. On paper, it was a quiet assignment. Keep the peace, manage the borders. In reality, it was a door to unimaginable power. Gaul was restless. Tribes fought each other as much as Rome. And Caesar knew something the Senate did not. If he could unite Gaul under his banner, he could unite Rome under his name. For 8 years, Caesar fought across Gaul, through forests, rivers, and mountains, against warriors who fought like ghosts, appearing from the trees, vanishing into the mist. But Rome only saw the victories. Every battle sent wagons of gold and letters of glory back to the city. He wasn't just winning wars, he was winning hearts. And that was the problem, because in the shadows of the Senate, a whisper began to grow. Caesar has become too powerful. By 50 BC, Caesar's victories had made him the most famous man in Rome. But fame was dangerous. The Senate, led by Pompey, his former ally, decided it was time to cut him down. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, which meant no legions, no power, and no protection from prosecution. Caesar understood exactly what that meant. It was not an invitation. It was a death sentence. Caesar reached the Rubicon, the border of his province. One step beyond, and he would be at war with Rome. He paused. The Republic he had served, the Senate he had charmed, all stood against him. And then, he spoke the words no one could take back.
Alia iacta est.
The die is cast. There was no turning back now. Rome belonged to the fastest sword, and the boldest man. Once across the Rubicon, Caesar moved like a storm. No speeches, no hesitation. City after city surrendered without a fight. Senators fled south to join Pompey. Caesar's gamble was working. Fear moved faster than his army. Pompey, unready for war, abandoned Rome entirely. He crossed the sea to Greece to gather forces for the counterstrike. The Republic was now 2 armies, 2 masters, 1 fate. Caesar chased Pompey across the Adriatic. risking winter seas to keep the pressure alive. Pompey commanded the Senate's finest legions. Caesar, fewer men, but veterans who had followed him through Gaul's mud and Britain's storms. It would end not in speeches, but in blood. Summer 48 BC, Pharsalus. A plain in Greece that would decide Rome's fate. Pompey had 80,000 men, fresh, well-fed. The Senate's last desperate hope. Caesar had half that. But his men were killers, hardened by 10 years of Gaul. Pompey's plan was simple: crush Caesar's right flank with overwhelming cavalry, then roll up the line. The plain erupted. Shouts, hooves, the ground shook under the weight of the charge. It worked at first. Pompey's cavalry drove Caesar's men back until they hit an invisible wall. A trap. Caesar had hidden a line of fresh troops, waiting for that one perfect moment. In minutes, the flank collapsed. The Senate's army unraveled. Pompey fled the field. The Republic, as Rome had known it, was finished. Pompey fled, not to Rome. Rome was lost to him. He ran east, to Egypt, a kingdom young and unstable, but rich, and ruled by a boy king who owed Rome everything. In his mind, Egypt was a refuge, a place to raise another army, to come back for revenge. But as he sailed, he didn't know the letters had already been sent. Messages from Caesar, whispered promises to Egypt's court. They greeted him warmly, old allies, smiling, inviting him ashore. He went willingly, dignified, as if still a Roman consul, even in defeat. Then, in the shallows, as the Egyptian shore grew close, the blade came, a gift for Caesar. When Caesar saw what had been done, he did not smile. The man who had once been his friend deserved a soldier's death, not this. Caesar arrived in Alexandria, expecting to claim Egypt as a prize. Instead, he stepped into a civil war. Two rulers, both claiming the throne. On one side, a teenage king with greedy advisors. On the other, a queen in exile, waiting for the right moment to return. The court was a nest of knives. And Caesar, a foreigner, with just a handful of legionaries, walked right into it. She could not walk through the gates. She was too hated. So Cleopatra chose something bolder. Under cover of night, she slipped into the city and into a carpet. When the fabric fell away, Caesar saw not just a queen, but an opportunity. Two ambitious rulers, both surrounded by enemies, both in need of an ally. That night, an alliance was struck, sealed not just by politics, but by something far more dangerous. By morning, the boy king's army had surrounded the palace, thousands of soldiers, chariots, archers, all waiting to kill the Roman intruder, and the queen who sided with him. For weeks, they were trapped, cut off from food, cut off from reinforcements. Every corridor smelled of smoke, every shadow hid a knife. It was not a court anymore. It was a fortress under siege. Caesar's only hope. Control the harbor. The fighting was brutal. Blades rang on shields. The air was thick with salt, fire, and the screams of the dying. In the chaos, flames leaped from ship to shore, and part of the great library was lost to history. It was a gamble worthy of Caesar. Take the harbor, or lose everything. That night, the water ran red, and Alexandria belonged to no one. In the deadlock of the siege, hope came on the tide. Legionaries hardened by the Eastern campaigns, men who had marched through deserts, stormed cities, and had no fear of a palace wall. With fresh troops at his side, Caesar turned the war inside out. The palace was no longer a prison. It was a launch point. The boy king fled the city. He would make his stand at the Nile. But the Nile is a dangerous ally. It does not care who is king. Caesar struck fast, trapping the boy between the river and the Roman line. In the final moments, the king's chariot tipped into the water. Whether he drowned in the mud or was dragged down by his own armor, no one could say. The boy king vanished beneath the river and did not rise again. When the river returned the boy king's body, Egypt had no ruler. Caesar placed the crown upon Cleopatra's head, and beside her, a younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, a king in name only. To the people, she was Pharaoh by divine right. To Caesar, she was Egypt, a partner, an ally, and perhaps something more dangerous, an equal. The war in Alexandria had ended, but the city bore its scars: burned docks, shattered statues, but most of all, a wealth of knowledge turned into ashes with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. Whispers on the streets of a queen who owed her throne to Rome. Caesar returned to Rome with a victory, a queen's gratitude, and a child she would soon bear. The Nile had claimed a king, but it had also bound a queen and a conqueror in a bargain that neither could fully control. In the spring of 46 BC, Rome saw something it had never seen before: a queen, foreign, radiant, walking beside Julius Caesar, as though she belonged in the very heart of his republic. To the people, it was spectacle. To the Senate, it was a warning. Caesar was not just a general anymore. He was beginning to look like a king. Caesar did not house Cleopatra in the palace, but in a villa beyond the Tiber, close enough for comfort, far enough to quiet scandal. She was carrying his child. Rome whispered the name already: Caesarion, Little Caesar. The people gossiped, the Senate seethed, and Caesar smiled. Because for him, Cleopatra was not just a lover, she was leverage. By day, they spoke of borders, grain fleets, and the stability of the East. By night, they spoke of power, how it should be won, and how it should be kept. To Caesar, she was a sovereign who understood ambition. To Cleopatra, he was a man who could make her son the ruler of the greatest empire in history. And in that shared vision, they forgot something fatal. Rome was listening. Cleopatra's arrival had done something Caesar's enemies could not. It made him look untouchable. For men like Brutus and Cassius, this was dangerous. A dictator was one thing. A dictator with a foreign queen and an heir. That was the end of the Republic. Marcus Junius Brutus, a man born into nobility, but cursed by contradictions. His father was killed by Pompey many years before. His mother Servilia was Julius Caesar's famous mistress. When Caesar and Pompey became enemies, he sided with Pompey in the Civil War of 49 BC. But after Pompey's defeat, Caesar did not punish him. Instead, Caesar pardoned Brutus and welcomed him into his circle, even making him praetor, a high-ranking magistrate. This pardon made Brutus indebted to Caesar, friend, protege, almost a son, which is why his eventual betrayal cut so deep. They say Brutus was torn between gratitude and principle, between affection and fear. But Rome's whispers grew louder, the Senate's daggers grew sharper, and Brutus listened. In a villa far from the Forum, the whispers turned into vows. Some argued for exile, others for public trial, but each plan ended the same way, with Caesar alive. Cassius said it first, though all had thought of it. To save the Republic, we must kill the man who would be king. When Brutus agreed, the room fell silent. It changed everything. What was once murder became justice. What was once envy became destiny. The Republic's fate was sealed. They chose the Ides of March, a day sacred to Mars, Rome's god of war. They would strike in the Senate House, where no weapons were allowed, except their own, hidden in folds of cloth. It was not bravery that bound them together, but fear. Fear of what Caesar might become if they waited even a month longer. None of them saw a father, or a man in love. They saw only a crown already resting on his head. The morning was bright, but the air felt heavy. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had begged him not to go. She spoke of omens, of nightmares, of blood flowing from the Senate's steps. Caesar laughed them away. He had defeated Gaul, crushed Pompeii, and bent Egypt to his will. What could a room of old men do to him? Caesar enters the Senate chamber, unaware of the plot against him. First came petitions. Then the circle tightened, a tug on his toga, a hand on his arm. And then, the first blade. They came at him from all sides, each thrust more desperate than the last. He fought at first, then saw a face he knew. And in that moment, Caesar did not curse him. He simply let go. It was not the clash of swords that reached Cleopatra first, but the silence. When the words left his mouth, she did not cry out. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Rome had killed her lover, her ally, her shield against the Senate's spite. She knew the city would turn on her next, and so the Queen of Egypt began to plan her escape. Rome was no longer safe. The men who killed Caesar spoke of restoring the Republic, but Cleopatra knew better. To them, she was a foreign queen, a seductress who had twisted Rome's greatest general. Her son, Caesar's son, was a living threat to their power. So she slipped away, down the river, into the open sea. The journey back to Alexandria was silent, but her mind was anything but. Egypt welcomed her back as queen, but the throne she returned to was cracked beneath her feet. Brutus expected the Senate and people to hail him as a liberator. Instead, chaos. The public mourned Caesar. Riots broke out, and the liberators were forced to flee Rome. Brutus later raised an army in Greece, but was defeated by Mark Antony and Octavian at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Facing capture, Brutus committed suicide, falling on his own sword, held by a loyal soldier. Rome's civil war had split the empire. Mark Antony held the east, Octavian the west, and both watched Egypt closely. Cleopatra had survived by aligning herself with power. Now, she would have to choose again, and her choice would decide the fate of empires.